Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, or stream us on Spotify. And if you're enjoying Because the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. You can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com.
Yes. What's up, Erica?
It's kind of a sad day today. Not even kind of. It's a pretty sad day today.
It's a big bummer. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that was a very Paul-like response. We'll get to that. I'm sure everybody listening knows today, December 8th, the day the podcast comes out, is the 40th anniversary of John Lennon's murder in New York City.
God.
I can't believe it's been 40 years.
I know.
Yeah. Not that I was alive for it, but I remember the 20th anniversary very clearly. God, time flies.
I remember 25. I was here in New York for 25. And living around here, too, around the Upper West Side. So I remember all the vigils, and I'm sure that there'll be quite a bit of that today.
So we don't want to do our usual shenanigans that we do at the top of every podcast, but I did want to take a second just to remind you guys that we do have our monthly giveaways going on, and thank you so much. You guys are killing it with entering, and thank you so much for your participation, for following us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and leaving us reviews. And it's just been wonderful to hear from you guys. And so we've still got December's going on. Obviously, it just started. This month, you can win a Strawberry Fields tote bag, a magnet from the Cavern Club, which is pretty sweet, I gotta say. I have it on my fridge. And a set of coasters that was given to me by the fine folks at the Fab Four Cafe, which is on the dock in Liverpool, right where you get the ferry to cross the Mersey. And these coasters are pretty cool because they come together to make a puzzle. So they form a Beatles picture. So fun if you have kids or if you just like want to show off your coaster game. So you can go to our website, bcthebeatles.com, to enter. We have a giveaway link on the left-hand side. Yeah, you can also click on our link in bio on Twitter and go straight there. So make sure to do that. We'll have a new one in January. But yeah, you've got a little bit left to go, about 24 days.
That is quite a sweet prize. If I could enter, I would.
I know. Well, it's December. It's like the holidays. You got to do something special. So
yeah.
And congrats to our 2 past winners. We've been doing this for 2 months now, Megan and Michael. You guys rock. And excited to see who's going to join them in the winner's circle.
Exciting stuff.
Yes.
And now to our main feature. We talk with documentarian Sarah Stacey about her new John Lennon documentary.
We are joined today by Sarah Stacey. She's a podcaster and radio producer who recently released the audio documentary Lennon 40 Years On. And what it does is it mixes firsthand experiences of the day that John was killed with historian analysis and John's own words and his music. The documentary looks at the impact of John's murder on what it had on fans, the cities he called home, the music world, and his own legacy. Sarah has a master's in radio production and is a content creator with Ireland's Today FM station, working on their flagship show, The Last Word. Sarah also hosts the new podcast, Tell Me About Your Dog, which Erica's been on, where she interviews dog owners about their best friends. And I think on that episode that you were on, Erica, we found out that who Rosie's favorite Beatle is.
Yes, my dog's favorite Beatle is... I'll let you hear it when you download Sarah's podcast.
No. Go listen to the podcast. It's super, super fun.
All I'm going to say is that my dog and I do not have the same favorite Beatle.
You have like opposites.
Yeah. Well,
as far as you're concerned, anyway.
Welcome, Sarah.
Podcast. Let's talk to Sarah. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm so excited because this is my favorite Beatles podcast of all
That's
time.
so fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been listening since you guys started it, so it's just really exciting to be on it.
Aww. Well, that's so sweet. We're so happy you're here. And we always ask our guests, tell us a little bit about yourself, especially how did you become a Beatles fan?
I've been a Beatles fan for as long as I can remember. It's probably a cliche to say that, but I think most people have a specific moment in their lives when they discovered the Beatles, but I don't really have that because I literally cannot remember a time when I wasn't a Beatles fan. My parents had the Red and Blue albums on cassette, and they were constantly being played around the house and in the car. So it's the first music I have any real memory of hearing. Apparently, as a toddler, I was always asking for the Beatles on car journeys. My dad says I used to shout the word Beatles over and over.
Aw.
As I got older, I just started collecting the albums for myself, read all the books, bought everything there was to buy, and just became obsessed. So I think the best way I can describe it is that the Beatles are like a comfort blanket. When I hear them, even today, I just get this feeling of comfort and familiarity that I only really get from them. So that's pretty much how I became a Beatles fan.
Oh,
Aww.
I love that description.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, we can all relate to that. I have to ask, are you a red album person or a blue album person?
I think to begin with, I was a Red Album person. One of the first Beatles songs I remember was Yesterday, so I think that's kind of tied up with some of my earliest memories. But I think as I got older, I became more of a Blue Album person.
It often happens that way. I thought as a kid they looked super scary on the Blue Album cover. Like, how did they
Yeah,
become that with the beards and everything? Like when you're really young, you know?
Totally.
So it takes a while.
I used to compare those two pictures and I just couldn't believe it was the same people.
Oh my God, me
Yeah,
too. All the time.
Yeah, I mean, how can you change so much in 9 years? So crazy.
yeah,
When you're that young, you don't really understand facial hair in the same way as you
no,
might now.
definitely not.
And it's just such a mystery to how you can do that. You're a Beatles fan and you're also a radio producer. So, how did you get the idea to do this project and how did it come about?
Well, I've been working in Today FM, which is a national commercial station here in Ireland, since 2017. So I work on a current affairs show and I'm just constantly getting ideas for radio documentaries, most of which never actually see the light of day because I probably shouldn't admit to this on a podcast, but I am terrible at finishing projects. I'm great at
No.
abandoning things. And then I'm like 2 years later, I realize, oh, yeah, I have all these ideas written down that I've never done. So the idea came to me in September of last year. I was basically just talking to my dad about John Lennon. And it just occurred to me that next year would be the 40th anniversary. And as you know, obviously, December the 8th every year is a big deal for Beatles fans, but 40 years is a big anniversary. So, out of the blue, my dad just said, well, why don't you make a documentary about it? So, I expected that there would be loads of things marking the anniversary. So, I started thinking about what I could do that was a little bit different. I didn't want to make another profile of John's life because there's plenty of those already, and I couldn't do any better than that. But I also didn't want to focus on the specific details of his murder. So I decided to look at his legacy and just try to get to the heart of what he means to people today. So I pitched it to one of my bosses in Today FM. And as luck would have it, he also loves the Beatles and that whole era of music in general. So I knew it was something he'd be interested in. Thankfully, he was. And over the summer, I just started interviewing people and putting everything together. So here it is.
Let's talk about the documentary and the documentary's subject. This is a tough one for a lot of people. I mean, the tragic murder of John Lennon 40 years ago marks the fact that he's been gone more years than he's even been alive. So this is a huge, huge anniversary. And it affects everybody differently depending on whether you were there or not. And one of the things that we get in the documentary is the wide range of feelings and impressions of that day. What were your impressions of that day?
Well, I wasn't born in 1980, so I obviously have no first-hand experience or memory of that day. But it was something that I remember becoming aware of quite early on in my life. I remember when I was learning more about who the Beatles were, I was told, probably by one of my parents, that's John Lennon, and something really sad and terrible happened to him. Obviously, I didn't know all the details of it at the time, but I knew that someone had shot him in New York where he lived. And I do remember thinking about it at a young age and wondering why anyone would do something like that. When you're a kid, you're kind of naive and you have a very simple view of the world. And it was just like, I don't understand why this would happen. Like, it's a difficult thing for an adult to comprehend, let alone a child.
Yeah. And I think for me, it was something because I wasn't born either when it
Mm.
happened. And it's something that as a Beatles fan, it comes in the package of like learning
Yeah.
about the Beatles. It's just sort of like, I don't remember ever not knowing that he wasn't dead. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
That I always knew about his murder. And I think that's part of his, as you explore in the documentary, and as we talk a lot about in the context of who John was as a person, it's like that's just part of it, and that's sort of like what has made him into this like enigma that he is today, is his murder. I really enjoyed hearing everybody's perception of that day and the impact and where they were from the first generation fans that you spoke to. And I sort of experience it now when I speak to younger fans who weren't alive when George Harrison died. It's obviously not kind of the same circumstances, but it sort of makes all of that sort of relatable. That makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I was 9 when George died, and I do remember it. And obviously, I was a Beatles fan. But yeah, I remember seeing it on the news because I don't think I had heard anything about the fact that he was ill. But yeah, I do remember very clearly learning about John's murder because it was just such a violent thing to hear about, at that age.
Yeah. I remember not being able to watch that part in A Hard Day's Night where he's in the bath and he's pretending that he was hit by a U-boat or something. You know that part where they're in the hotel
Yeah.
room?
Yeah.
And I
Wow.
remember very clearly thinking, like, he wasn't wearing a shirt in that. I was thinking that's where he got shot and he's pretending that he's
Wow.
dead in the tub and, like, this
Oh
is
my
horrible.
God.
Like, I had to
Oh,
fast forward past that for years.
wow. It's
Wow. Yeah.
amazing
I
how
mean,
everyone perceives these things because I that never would have occurred to me.
Sorry.
same. Now
Now
now we're never going to watch it the same way.
I still get a little, like, freaked out when I see that scene.
Oh my God. I'm never going to enjoy John Lennon shirtless again. Thanks, Erica.
I know, it
Thank
does do
you.
that to you, but there's still plenty of Paul shirtless that you can move on to,
It's
which
not the
isn't bad.
same. Anyway, yeah, I kind of felt the same about Happiness is a Warm Gun. When I first
Mm.
discovered the White Album, I was like, what the hell? Why would he sing this song? But of course, he's making a statement. He doesn't know the future,
Yeah.
obviously.
And he's also kinda talking about his penis.
Dot, dot, dot.
It does! It does, it's about sex with Yoko.
What? Ugh,
Yeah, happiness is a warm gun is
I don't think I've ever put that together. Like, geez, okay. Anyway,
so back to the documentary,
um,
how did you feel people reacted to it differently? Because you interviewed people of all ages who were there, at least one person, Susan Ryan, who was in New York and
Mm.
who actively experienced it. How are people looking at the event when they were there versus people like us who either weren't alive or weren't old enough to understand it?
There was a difference between the two. I mean, with the first gen fans, the people I spoke to were all different ages when he died. Some were young children, some were teenagers, some were adults. But I think the one thing that struck me about all of them was just how much it shocked them. Like, for example, Ken Womack talks about trying to find the reason why it happened, but realizing that there is no reason because it was just completely senseless. And then Susan Ryan, as you said, her story really resonated with me. She was a college student on Long Island at the time, and she just describes everybody on campus crying and being absolutely devastated. And she was someone who used to hang around outside the Dakota where John lived, hoping to see him. She really summed up the pride that New Yorkers felt in having John live in their city. And the word she used to describe how she felt that day was desolation, which I just thought was really powerful. So I really wanted to get the experiences of people who weren't alive in 1980 or who had no memory of it, because as someone in that position myself, I think it's important to highlight our stories as well. And obviously, I spoke to both of you about your experiences, and I could really relate to what you said. But I think the key difference is that for us, it's, as you were saying earlier, it's always been part of how we have experienced the Beatles story. And we can only imagine how it must have felt to be hit with that news. I don't like to think about it, obviously, but if something like that were to happen to Paul or Ringo now, can you imagine the absolute shock and despair that we would all be hit with? I think it made me consider that a bit more.
Definitely. One thing that Susan actually brought up that I thought was interesting, because it never really occurred to me to think about this, but she really underscored the fact that Chapman, the man who killed John, was not a New Yorker. It never occurred to me that that was important, but it really is, because you talk a lot about how important New York was to John and how safe he felt there and the reason why he was there. And so I guess it is really important to make that distinction, that this is sort of like an outsider that infiltrated, his safety bubble and did this.
I appreciate that too. I mean, as a current New Yorker,
Yeah, you're a New Yorker.
I live only blocks from the Dakota, so New Yorkers, I think, are very protective of their city. I feel better about the fact that as a city, he put his trust in the city and it wasn't the city that betrayed him.
Absolutely. I mean, it kind of shows in how people reacted in New York as well. When as soon as it happened, they gathered outside the Dakota, and I think just showed their appreciation for him and the fact that he chose to live there. So, yeah, when Susan mentioned that, I hadn't really given it much thought either, but I do think it was a very important point to make.
Yeah. And they still think of him as one of our own. I mean, the outpouring of love on his birthday was amazing over at the Strawberry Fields Memorial. And I'm sure that there will be similar outpourings of grief this week.
Are you planning to go down there, Erica?
I will probably stop by, but I don't know if I'll spend a lot of time there. There are many people who spend the day there as a vigil. I don't think that I have the emotional fortitude to do that, but I probably will stop by.
Yeah. Well, speaking of emotional fortitude, you talk you talk in the documentary, which I think is a really important point to bring up during this whole horrific event that happened, was Paul's reaction to John's murder. And it's legendary, the interview he gives sort of on the spot of, how do you feel, Paul? And he famously says it's a drag. And I love that you include the news clip in there, because you can really hear like sort of the circumstances around the interview and Paul's tone. Let's talk a little bit about Paul in this. You can't really talk about John without Paul. How did this event and the sort of hullabaloo around it, how did that affect Paul's reputation and perception of him going forward and his talents?
God, I can't even tell you. I was actually so excited to answer this question because I feel so strongly about it.
Yeah.
And then Paul is also my favorite Beatle, so yeah, I could talk all day about this. As I said, I wasn't around in 1980, but we've all seen that footage, and I've always felt so strongly that that incident marked a kind of turning point in the public's perception of Paul, at least in Britain anyway, because a lot of Americans I spoke to for the documentary didn't remember it being that big a deal. But I think for British people, it might have been. I could be wrong, but that's just my opinion. So when Paul said those words, a lot of people pounced on them and accused him of being callous and cold-hearted. But I look at that clip on YouTube now, and some of the comments that I see, like, I can't believe in 2020 that we still have to explain the concept of shock and grief to some people. I mean, it doesn't really come across on radio, even though I included the clip. But if you look at Paul's face, it's obvious how he's feeling. But he can't articulate it in that moment. And I don't think anybody could who was that close to John.
People don't really know what had happened to him in the 12 hours or so before that.
Yeah,
the story goes that he got a call at his home with Linda, and it was, early the next day at that point in England, and he was so distraught he immediately went to the studio to record. He met George Martin there, and that's all they could do was they opened a big bottle of scotch and they drank that scotch down and they just commiserated with one another. So he was grieving all day and probably quite drunk when he came out to be surprised by all these reporters.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't look, he looked zoned out and just
he looks ashen.
Yeah, Exactly.
It's interesting that I think it's Jackie Spencer in the documentary makes the point too of it, like, it's sort of a Liverpudlian response, like it's a
Yeah.
drag. When I hear it now, I hear, the reporter saying, like, how do you feel, Paul? Whatever. And then it's sort of like, how do you expect me to feel? Like, I sort of feel like, well, it's a drag, like kind of sarcastic.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to read too much into it because I do agree. I think it's a lot of shock and, just a sort of a knee jerk reaction to it. But yeah, there's a lot behind it, obviously.
And Paul is notoriously not good with death.
Yeah.
He, had a almost similar response when his mother died. He asked his father, "What will we do without her money?" He didn't go to
Yeah.
his father's funeral. He does not process this well, and to have to make a public statement just hours after he found out, it just wasn't his forte. It doesn't have anything to do with, I don't think, his actual mindset.
No, not at all. I think the press were guiltier than fans in a way of demonizing him for that. I mean, I read something once that talked about how much the press loved Paul in the early days of the Beatles because he was so charming and friendly. But after John's death, he was really painted as kind of shallow and talentless, even. Like, I think it was happening to a degree with Wings in the 70s, but I think it definitely got worse after 1980. I think when John died, there was a tendency to remember only the good things, and it became very easy for people to say that he was the creative one and he was the genius, and Paul was somehow lesser, which obviously isn't true.
Yeah, it's almost like for every John reaction, there's an equal and opposite
Yeah.
reaction to Paul.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and you made that point in the documentary, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very consistent when it comes to my blind defense of Paul McCartney.
You're an apologist. Haha. I have to
Apologist,
toss
yeah.
that
I love
in
that
all the
word.
time.
I love it.
I think also, like, if you look at the time period too, when you talk about the documentary where Paul and John's relationship was, a point of contention, especially when you had sort of like the dust up around, will there ever be a Beatles reunion? And the mythology of them sort of watching SNL the night that Lorne Michaels makes the offer, and them sort of thinking like, oh, maybe we should go down and it'll be really funny. And the public not really sure of where they stood with each other. And it was super important, this legendary partnership. And so to hear Paul sort of cap it off with it's a drag, of course, people are going to say, wow, Paul McCartney, what an asshole. And then the St. John Lennon thing starts and it sort of perpetuates itself.
Ugh, and Paul's been trying to explain this away for the past 30 years now.
Oh my God. Yeah. Like we talked about, I think before Erica, in a podcast about the song on New early days, where he basically says, I was there and you weren't, you don't know
Yeah.
what happened. And he's defending his contributions and his ideas and him as a musician. It's like, it's really tragic that the guy's like 78 now, still having to answer to this. Somebody, I think maybe it's Jude in the documentary, makes a point where it's like you can't compete with a dead man.
I think that was Stephen Kennedy, actually, from the Dublin Beatles Festival. Yeah, he made a comparison to Joyce and one of his stories about competing with a ghost. Yeah.
And even Paul was trying his whole career to kind of sidestep around it and address it without addressing it. If you haven't seen the 48 Hours with Paul McCartney special from the late 80s, it's on YouTube and I highly recommend it. It tracks him on that 89-90 world tour. And they interview him, and the guy asks him something about being compared to John and John's work. And he's like, basically says, well, it's not fair the way they portray me, but what can I do? And he says it's unseemly to talk about it. He doesn't know how to address it because, you can't compete with the dead. And then all of a sudden you're speaking ill of the dead just to preserve his own reputation.
Exactly.
There's
yeah.
no way he can win there.
Honestly, I have to say it's one of my biggest bugbears as a Beatles fan. And I see it so often at Beatles events and in everyday life, especially with older male fans, to be honest. Not to denigrate older male fans, but whenever I see this happen, it tends to be when it happens. Like last year, I was at a Beatles event and there was a guy playing some songs. My friend and I were there. And he was introducing, I think it was The Long and Winding Road. And he said to the crowd, I have a confession to make. Paul McCartney is my favorite Beatle. And the audience actually booed.
Ew.
Yeah.
Ew.
And my friend and I just
Why?
looked at each other and we just couldn't believe it. Like, it's just this
What?
idea that, you can't say Paul is your favorite Beatle. It's just
That's crazy.
I've
yeah.
never heard of that reaction happening. Like, is there something in particular that would have sparked that? Because I can't. There's nothing negative about that I can think of.
I'm just assuming that it has to do with this myth of John being the cooler Beatle. I mean,
Yeah.
I was doing a Beatles quiz a few years. It was just after New had been released, actually, and I was put on a team with this guy, and I was just making conversation, and I asked him if he'd bought it yet, and he said, "Oh God, no, I wouldn't buy that. I'm a John Lennon fan."
Oh,
So
God.
I should have challenged him
Oh
on it, but instead
hell!
I just kind of sheepishly asked, "Okay, so which John Lennon album is your favorite?" And he said, "Oh, well, I only know the song Imagine."
Oh,
What?
for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
Oh my god!
Well, he should listen to your documentary where you rightfully point out very clearly that John's inspiration for getting back into music and writing double fantasy was coming up. Paul's coming up
Yes.
in the late 70s.
Exactly. I mean, I think this is I really when I had the idea for this, I knew I had to put this in there. I was like, I am going to make sure that Paul gets his recognition because, you can't talk about John without Paul and vice versa. So it's just so important, I think.
That is much appreciated. I think that we do a lot to, well, culture in general has done a lot to deify John as this peacenik saint Christ figure, which and I think your documentary explores that, but he was not that in real life. He was not sinner nor saint. So from what you heard from everybody that you interviewed and from your own impressions, who do you think John actually was?
I think it continues to be a tough question, and I knew it was a tough question when I asked everybody in the documentary. But I think what comes across most is I think John was a supremely talented human being, emphasis on the human being part. I think it was Susan Ryan says in the documentary that he was not completely about peace and love, but he was also not about peace and love. And I would agree with that. He was somewhere in between, but then again, aren't we all somewhere in between? People
Mm.
are complex, and John was no different. He had his flaws, and they are kind of detailed in the documentary. He could be hurtful to people who cared about him. He wasn't the best father in the world. He didn't treat women very well when he was younger, and he could be jealous and insecure. But he knew all of this. Like, he was always honest about his failings and tried to make up for them later on. So I think above all, he was an honest person. He was a revisionist, I think. He was constantly changing his opinions over the years. But one thing that you could say for John is that I think he always believed in what he was saying at the time that he said it. And that can get you in trouble sometimes. I mean, I remember speaking to you, Alison, when I interviewed you. We were talking about what John would have been like on social media. Um,
Yeah.
and I think he would have been as outspoken as ever. But there were signs in 1980 that he was kind of maturing and becoming more at ease with himself. So hopefully that would have continued. I'd like to think also that he would be close to Julian and Sean, and that he and Yoko would have hopefully continued their activism. So it's hard to say, but I don't think he would have changed too much apart from maybe coming to terms with some things in his past, regrets that he may have had.
Yeah. And if you consider also, like in 1980, he's just coming off of like 5 years of
Yeah.
being a house husband, which I'm sure involved a lot of self reflection, just having nothing to do except for take care of the baby and bake bread, as he said.
He would have loved quarantine. We're all making sourdough.
Oh my God. He would have like a bread making TikTok.
Right?
Yes.
Oh my God. Oh, I love this. This is a great thing that's playing out in my head right now. But yeah, Sarah, I love that. I think you're totally right. He was committed to whatever he said when he said it. I think that's a wonderful way to sort of sum up John, because people love to deify him or condemn him based on any sort of arbitrary experience or things he said. But John was evolving. He was a human. He was flawed. I love that you included the clip in your documentary of him saying, I was a hitter.
Mhm.
And he would always be the first person to say, I'm a bastard. I was a bastard. I did all these horrible things. And I think that's something that's really important to bring up when we talk about the 40th anniversary of his death and his legacy and that kind of thing. It's only fair to let him be the complicated person that he was.
I really like what you said about John fully believing in what he was doing at any time. He had all of these periods or phases. He had his psychedelic phase
Mm.
and his, so he calls Fat Elvis phase and his heroin phase and his peacenik phase. There were so many different Johns. And the fact that he was a songwriter meant that a lot of these different Johns were etched in stone at the time he wrote certain songs. And it's very easy to paint a one-dimensional picture of somebody based on one song or another song, but he really is this very complicated person, as we all are. John's legacy is richer if you consider all of his parts.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to do that, because then you're not being true to him really if you're not showing all sides of him. And it's a difficult thing to do, because there was just so much to his life, and there's no way, like, I could make a 10-part series and I don't think I would be able to cover everything about who John was and what happened in his life. But if I can just give a clearer picture and just, talk about all sides to some degree, then I think that I'd be happy with that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think John would be happy with that. I don't think John would ever want to see himself or have other people see him as black and white. I think he would be the first to say, like, I have many sides, good and bad.
Yeah, he definitely wouldn't have been good with cancel culture, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think that would have been something, like, I can, whenever I hear these stories of these kind of things happening recently, I just think, John would definitely have had something to say about that.
Yes, he would be retweeting.
I would have
Yeah.
loved to see his Twitter around Donald Trump. It would have been funny.
Yes.
He would have been like quote tweeting Trump being like, shut the fuck up, asshole, or like something.
Yeah, he
Like,
and Mark Hamill would have been the top two, like,
yes.
Trump trolls.
That would have been amazing. Oh, yes, that lives in my brain in a special
Yeah.
place.
Mhm. So I want to turn to something else that I think is a very important part of your documentary, and it is that you are a next gen fan, that you were born after he died, and that you're still focusing on John Lennon nonetheless. What do you think John's legacy will be for the next 40 years, the next 50 years? And how is it different from what maybe John's legacy should be?
Well, most importantly, I think he'll continue to be remembered as one of the greatest musicians and songwriters that there's ever been. So I don't think that will ever change. I think he'll still be remembered for his activism and how outspoken he was, because I think that's one of the things people loved about him. But there are some things that I would like to see us move on from. Some of the things we talked about, the idea that he was some kind of peace guru, which, I don't think he would be comfortable with at all. And then going back to what we touched on earlier with Paul, I think he would have definitely wanted people to see him and Paul as equals. It's that thing where even with sibling rivalries, it's like you can say whatever you want about your
Mm.
brother or your sister, but no one else can. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what the relationship was like between John and Paul. So I don't think he would be happy with how certain people have portrayed Paul over the years. And then, as with the myths about John being a saint, there's also a lot of myths about him, supposedly being a terrible person that just aren't true. Like, I think certain biographies might have been responsible for this since he died.
Yes.
Stories about violence that have been denied by Cynthia, by Yoko, by Julian. So I hope we can move on from that to going forward, especially because, he isn't here to defend himself. And there will eventually come a time when other people who knew him aren't around to defend him either. So I think it's important to move past that. But I think the best thing that we can do is to celebrate his music, because above all, that's what I think he would want to be remembered for. I mean, he sometimes said that he didn't care what people would think of him after he died, but by 1980, he was really starting to embrace his legacy as a Beatle and talking about what he hoped audiences would take from his new music. So, although nobody really knows for sure what he would be doing now, I think that the mindset that he was in 1980 is a nice way to remember him, because he was in a good place personally and creatively.
I think it was Ken Womack on the documentary who was speaking about John perhaps touring and how he was sketching out like a stage plot and coming to terms with the fact that touring had changed and he would have to have pyrotechnics in his show.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really fun, and I actually didn't know that.
I didn't either. That's very
Yeah,
cool.
I
No, I
thought that was
didn't.
interesting. Interesting to think about John forward thinking that much, being like I would love to see John like coming to grips with the fact that he needs pyrotechnics at his show. He'd be like, "What the fuck? I need this."
Well, he saw the rock show, Paul McCartney. He saw
Exactly.
Live and Let Die. He's like, oh God.
I know. And then you look at what Paul does. Yeah, it's so funny. He's like, "Oh, I'm gonna have to do like a Wings thing." So yeah, like that. So that was very interesting, kind of see like what John would have done, and the next like at least few years, probably done some touring. And I can't remember who it was that mentioned that the Beatles probably would have reunited for Live Aid,
Yeah,
and
that was Stephen, I think. Yeah.
yeah, and how complicated that would have been. And I agree. He, says in the documentary that he wouldn't have wanted to see that, which I kind of
I
agree. I
agree.
think that would have been anticlimactic, I think he said.
Wasn't it Led Zeppelin who reunited for Live Aid and it just did not work out at all?
Yeah. So personally, Sarah, obviously you just made this amazing documentary. How has John's legacy impacted your life and career? Do you see yourself doing more of these like Beatles or John related radio documentaries?
I hope so, yeah. I mean, I've often tried to incorporate the Beatles into what I do. When I started out in college radio, my friend and I had a Beatles radio show. So,
Aw.
Fun.
yeah, so it's just any excuse really, any way that I can bring the Beatles into what I do. It's great. I mean, I would love to make more Beatles related documentaries in the future. There's just so many things you could cover. I mean, I would love to do something related to Paul at some point. It's just about really when a good story comes to you. So I'm sure something will come to me in the future.
Well, we can't wait to hear it, and we'll be happy to talk about Paul in any context, anytime, or I'm speaking for me, anytime.
Oh,
Um,
I love to talk about Paul. Come on. Good old Paul.
Okay, so I think that we have really made people excited about this documentary. I hope so. So, where can people find this? And I think you said it was available as of the day we're dropping this episode, which is the 8th of December.
Yes, it's streaming on our digital station, Today FM Rock Anthems from 9 p.m. Irish time. But you can also find it on todayfm.com from December the 8th and also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and a few other places where you get your podcasts. So by the time people hear this, I'm sure the best bet would be to find it on the website.
Excellent.
Amazing.
I'm so excited to share this with people. I think it's such a wonderful addition to the many, many tributes about John, because not only is it from a second gen point of view, but it explores topics that we don't always talk about during this time. And so I love it. So thank you so much. Where can we find you and your other work? And is there anywhere that you'd like people to get to know you better, follow you?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is at Sarah Stacey 92. And my website is sarahstaceyaudio.com if anyone is interested in hearing any of my other radio programs or podcasts.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. This has
Oh,
been so
brilliant.
much fun
Wonderful.
having you on. You have to come back.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'm so glad that you were both a part of the documentary and that you enjoyed it so much.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you for including us. It was really, really, really fun and a great excuse to talk about John and his legacy.
And we're back, and we end things the way we always end things, with our obsession of the moment. Allison, what's yours?
Okay, well, I have two. I play by my own rules.
Sometimes you just can't pick one.
I got to do two. So first, we talked on our Flaming Pie episode, our special about the box set, about the stuff you could buy on paulmccartney.com that was Flaming Pie themed, and we each got something. But I got the Flaming Pie stamper because it was like my dream as a kid to have the frickin' stamper, so I could just stamp everything with the Flaming Pie. So I finally got it because PaulMcCartney.com is really backed up apparently because of COVID and all that good stuff. But it is amazing, and I haven't used it yet because I can't find my ink pad, and I just I should just buy a new one. But I'm so happy to have it. It completes my life. I feel like a void has been filled.
Oh my god, do I need to send you, like, something from michaels.com? I will send this to you right
Oh
away.
my god, what? No, you don't have to. I really think I have I'm pretty sure I have an ink pad. Anyway, stay tuned for my saga of the ink pad. No, but my second one, well, God, we're all super excited for McCartney 3 right now, aren't we?
Mhm.
And I was so stoked. I saw earlier in the week that a McCartney 3 mural went up in London. And I was thinking, I'm like, oh my gosh, I hope they do one here in LA because they did, an Egypt Station one when that came out. And that was really cool. So I saw, shout out to one of the girls I follow on Instagram, Caitlin, who posted on her story that she was now by Capitol Records and a McCartney 3 mural had gone up. So I woke up really early next morning and I went down to see it myself, and it's very cool. We posted it on our Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Head over there and check it out. But it has lyrics and the music to trying to make this spoiler free, but I think it's probably my favorite song on the new album. But we'll get to that in a future episode.
The next episode, actually, because I think the next time we record is gonna be all about McCartney 3 after it comes out on December 18th.
Yes, exactly. And how could we not? I mean,
Duh.
duh.
Of
Anyway,
course.
so yeah, those are my two things. They're tied. I can't choose between them. And Erica, what is yours?
Mine is very related to your second obsession because when you posted the photo of this mural, I was looking at it, studying every nook and cranny, of course, to see what it was all about. And I noticed that there was this hashtag on it and a QR code, and the hashtag is 12 Days of Paul. And
Mm,
that sounded super fun. So I was like, what is 12 Days of Paul? And if you search it, you'll end up at 12days.mccartney3.com. What it is a map, and the map pinpoints 12 locations around the world. There's Tokyo, there's Sydney, Liverpool, London, Paris, Berlin, New York City, Toronto, Chicago, LA, Mexico City, and Rio. So those are the 12 locations. And every day it looks like one of the little die, the little 3 die that is the McCartney 3 logo symbol, turns from white to red. And the red dye have what 12 Days of Paul is, the white dye. And me in New York City, I'm still
you're still a
white.
white
So
guy. Yeah, gotta
yeah,
wait.
I'm still white. Sucks. But what it seems to be is that the 12 Days of Paul seems to represent the 12 songs on McCartney 3, or at least the 12 basic songs on McCartney 3. I'm sure there will be endless special cuts.
Ugh,
But
can't
those
wait.
are the so 12 songs, 12 days of Christmas. What it seems to be is a it's not a competition. What is it? It's just it's a call for musicians to
Yeah,
see their covers. So every day in each city, and this is something I'm very excited about for when it comes to my city, they build one of these murals with the sheet music to the song that's tied to the city and to that day of the 12 Days of Paul. Each city gets a different song as their focus cover, and they get one of these murals built somewhere in the city. I have to find where it's going to be in New York. If you live in one of those cities and find it, we'd love to see what you're seeing because it looks very cool.
working in music myself, it's interesting to watch this campaign. And Paul's team said that there's not going to be a single, from this album, which is odd, but not unheard of. Paul's very odd sometimes with his choices, and that is
Mm-hmm.
very cool. But it's interesting, the rollout has to do with these covers. So in some cases, people aren't going to hear Paul do these songs first. You're going to hear somebody random do it. And that's very intriguing. It's a very interesting way to do it.
Yeah, it's weird, and it only looks like they're offering a very short part of each song. So they're only asking people to cover like a page of the sheet music. So they're not they're not asking for a full cover. And yes, you can find this if it's not officially out yet, but it's out.
It's
If you know where to look, you can find it. But yeah, for a lot of people, it will be the first exposure to this music will be through other people's interpretations.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And, not to get too much into McCartney 3, but I did get a quote unquote text from Paul this morning. I don't know if you got this too, Erica, offering like a violet version. I'm like, Paul, you've got to chill on these different color variants.
I guess he's ghosting me because I didn't get the text and I would have wanted the text because purple is my favorite color and I probably would
Shit.
buy it.
Oh, damn. Yeah.
Damn you, Paul.
Let's see. It's, it's special violet edition.
Ooh, that sounds so nice. Why didn't he text me?
Damn it, Paul. Oh, it's like a hot pink, actually, it looks like. Anyway, I might get one of these actually. But yeah, it's Paul, like, chill on these colors, bro. Like, you've got like 60 million colors. You got the whole goddamn rainbow.
It would be cool to see all of them in the same room. It would be expensive, but it'd
That
be
would
cool.
be cool. Yeah, I'm sure somebody's doing it. If you're collecting all the color variants, like, let us know because we admire you. We applaud your effort.
Yeah. And as for the 12 Days of Paul covers, we're going to get a lot of chance to hear these different songs in a lot of different ways, and that's exciting. I'm sure we'll get into this on our McCartney 3 episode, but the way he markets his albums is always interesting. There's always something different. I mean, from the 70s, from his adventures with Percy Thrillington, which was actually our first episode.
Yeah, God, that takes me back.
Yeah, really. He's always got some interesting marketing ploy to get people interested. And I'm really interested in this. I think this is going to be fun. If you search on Twitter, hashtag 12 Days of Paul, there's quite a few people who have jumped on the challenge.
Good. It's something to bring a little bit of joy to this time of year, especially in this year, in this crazy effed up year. It's great. We have something to look forward to in a couple of weeks. New Paul record and a ton of covers.
People are home by themselves or just with their small family units, and he recorded it in Rockdown, as he would like to say in his dad jokes. So other people can kind of come together alone, be together apart during this weird quarantine time to share the new music in their own Rockdown situations.
Yeah, and that's very clever. So we'll be watching that as it unfolds. And yeah, again, we'll be talking more McCartney 3 our next episode. Well, until then, thank you for listening to Because the Beatles. And again, if you'd like to subscribe to us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening right now, Spotify, etc., and give us a rating and review, we would love that so much.
Yes, we would. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. If you find a 12 Days of Paul mural in your city, please tag us. I want to see all of them. All of them. Also, you can email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. See you next time.
Bye.